World War II started in 1939. The United States had stayed neutral up until December 7, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Much like 9/11, the attack on Pearl Harbor awakened the beast that is America. Up until the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States had been using battleships to fight wars. It wasn't until this attack that they realized that the best way to fight at sea was with aircraft carriers. Once the United States entered the war, they worked very hard on trying to break the Japanese code in order to gain an edge. They tried for months to break the code, but with no success. The machine that wrote the code was known only as Purple to the United States.
Tensions were rising in the Far East. The Japanese introduced a new, more complex cipher. The Japanese called the new machine the 97 Shiki Obon Injiki. The American codebreakers called it simply Purple. Purple was far more complex than its predecessor, but there were things working in the Allies' favor. While more sophisticated, Purple was not entirely unlike Red. Like the previous machine, Purple enciphered vowels and consonants separately, making decryption more manageable. Purple was also similar in that keying sequences were changed daily. The Allies were fortunate that in the transition between systems, some messages were sent in both the already compromised Red as well as the new Purple ciphers. This duplication gave Friedman's team considerable insight into one day's messages. In addition, the Japanese code clerks tended to follow a strict protocol in the language of their messages. Such repetition provided valuable clues to the nature of the entire system.
In a sense, the cryptanalyst didn't have to start from the very beginning, but rather the cryptanalyst knew that, if you have an opening of a letter and a closing of a letter, those are the parameters, and you can start to piece things together.
In the spring and summer of 1940, the traffic in Purple increased dramatically, especially between Tokyo and the Japanese embassies in Berlin and Rome. This was due to the impending Tripartite Pact, the treaty that would bind the Axis powers. The incredible influx of information gave the harried cryptologists more work, but also more clues.
They analyzed weeks and weeks' worth of messages. Statistically, they developed an appreciation for the subtle patterns that the machine generated, figured out how the system would encrypt using these on and off switching devices, and then the system was able to be read by the Americans.
By analyzing the substitution patterns inherent in the cipher, the SIS cryptologists were able to reverse engineer a device that would duplicate the output of the Japanese Purple machine. They designed a machine which used a dozen standard telephone stepping switches to scramble and unscramble messages. 2 keyboards were used for input and output. A plug board determined the keying sequence.
To encipher
message under that system. You type a letter on the first electric typewriter, goes through and the stepping switches, so forth, and out comes the enciphered version of it. But when you go to decipher it, you have the message, and you set up the wheels the same and have the same matrix. There's a plug board, and you have to get the plugs in the right positions. So then when you type the enciphered letter on the first typewriter, here comes the plain language on the other cipher.
With the completion of the purple analog, the SIS was able to decipher messages as fast as the Japanese code clerks themselves.
Now that the United States could listen to all of the Japanese messages, they knew every move that the Japanese Navy would make. One message that was heard talked about an attack on an Australian naval base in order to prevent the United States from using it. To stop the attack, the USS Yorktown and USS Lexington raced from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. Since the Japanese didn't know that their code was broken, the United States had the element of surprise. Once the United States arrived, they sent out scout planes to find the Japanese fleet. Once the coordinates were radioed in, they then sent out torpedo bombers and dive bombers to attack the Japanese carriers. At the end of the day, the carrier USS Lexington was badly damaged. They were able to keep her afloat for a little while, but it became apparent that it was going to sink. After the Lexington's crew was safely aboard the Yorktown, they sank the Lexington to prevent any secrets from falling into enemy hands. The United States may have broken the Japanese code, but they still didn't know what some of the code names were. They had heard of an attack plan for a place called AF, but unless they knew what AF was, they couldn't do anything. Based on previous messages, they were able to figure that the target was most likely Midway Island. To be sure, they sent an uncoded message saying that Midway was out of fresh water, since Midway didn't have its own fresh water supply, hoping the Japanese would hear it. They did. The Japanese then sent a message of their own out to their Pacific Fleet. From this message, the United States concluded that AF was Midway and it was going to be attacked. American aircraft carriers raced to the aid of Midway. Once again, the United States had the element of surprise. This helped them a great deal because the Japanese Navy had no idea they were coming, so they weren't prepared. When the American carriers arrived, they immediately sent out scout planes. After a while, the planes found the Japanese fleet and radioed in the coordinates. They then launched a dive bomber and torpedo bomber raid on the Japanese fleet. This raid was a complete disaster. Only one American survived. Right after the American raid was over, the Japanese launched their own raid. There would have been extensive damage done to the American carriers if they didn't have the ability to fill all the gas lines with carbon dioxide to prevent fires. Also, the United States had radar, so they had a 20-minute warning of the Japanese raids. This gave them time to launch aircraft to defend the carriers. As the Japanese were refueling and reloading from their raid, American dive bombers that have been circling for hours dive out of the clouds to take advantage of all the fuel and explosives in one place. The bombs caused mass destruction due to all the fuel and bombs on the deck. The battle endured for 3 more days. On the last day, the Japanese withdraw due to the fact that 9 of the U.S. dive bombers found their targets, sinking 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Due to the fact that most of the battleships were destroyed during the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was forced to use aircraft carriers. This proved to be very effective in the war, and they are still used today.